we'll get started. Sorry the slide's a little small because I have transcription on. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks all for joining me and taking the time to come to my talk and joining us for this session. Like Hannah said, I'm Limpisathian, a PhD candidate at the University of Oregon, and incoming professor, assistant professor at University of Wisconsin-Madison. So today I'm going to share a bit about my dissertation research and give you a little bit of the preview of the results from that. The research lies at the intersection of neuroscience and cartography with a focus or emphasis on visual contrast theories that we use in maps and the role that it plays in map cognition. As a side note, like I said, I have automated transcription enabled for this for accessibility considerations. So in this talk, I'm going to go through three parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about the motivation and background for this research. Then I'll go into a little bit of the reframing and reconceptualization of how I tackled these topics. And in part three, I'll jump into the actual experiment design and discuss some of the results from there. Okay, so part one. You might be wondering, why is it that I ended up trying to combine or do cartography with neuroscience? I am traditionally a trained scientific cognitive cartographer. At Penn State, I studied GIS cartography in my undergrad and then stayed on and did cartographic perception design research with Cindy Brewer for my master's. I'm also very well versed in production cartography and was a senior member of the cartography lab at Penn State and now also at UO. I've helped produce countless maps and infographics for various projects and clients. But when I did come over to UO, my PhD sort of shifted more into doing sort of map cognition research. What was super cool and interesting and different about my lab at UO is that instead of using some of the more traditional and exhausted tools that we have used for studying maps and the spatial processes, we were pushed to explore and test new tools and approaches for answering some of these geospatial questions. Specifically, many of us were trained in using cutting-edge exploratory neuroimaging methods to study some of these topics like spatial cognition and map reading. So that's ultimately led to the start of my journey in order to bridge my training and love for cartography with the tools and methods I was being introduced to in the lab. I dubbed my own scholarship Neuro-Carto, and this term really grounds myself, but I also like to think that it also helps ground others when I talk about my research. And when I do talk about my research, I want to stress and emphasize that I'm not a neuroscientist. What I do and what I'm interested in is still very much cartographic and is deeply rooted in cartographic thought. I just happen to use the knowledge and tools available from neuroscience to hopefully help answer some of these geographic questions. So a little throwback to my master's research. The goal of that, if you were here, you might have remembered a little bit at the NACIS conference in Montreal. But the goal of that research was essentially to create a Brewer-type tool that would aid map makers in designing maps with good visual contrasts. In all, for that project, I tested about 1,000 contrast permutations across a myriad of map design. But anyway, from that study, I found that while there were interesting patterns that pointed towards a better configuration of contrasts, there wasn't a best configuration. And that actually was more important about what the user thought about the map in terms of its aesthetic qualities that had an influence on whether or not they perceived the map as being effective in terms of understanding that. So at the end of the day, from that project, I came out with even more questions. My results indicated that it wasn't as simple as what was the best contrast schemes. And that also got me thinking, what if visual contrast is more than a perceptual issue, like how I was tackling it back then what really governs it? So that really led me down to this line of research that I'm doing now. Looking at the maps and my research at the time, I was convinced that visual contrast wasn't just important for simply seeing the map as a perceptual issue, that there was an underlying pattern that I saw that was driving it at a higher level. So therefore, the next logical step after perception in psychology research was cognition. And shifting over to cartographic cognition research, and there's been a great selection of many research by great names within cartographies and beyond and within geography on everything on how humans understand and use spatial information. But the problem is that most of these research have focused on how humans understand the spatial data themselves. But what I was especially interested in was how that process of understanding the information is being mediated or translated through the lens of cartographic design as how we express that information. So what is visual contrast exactly? And how is it important for map design? I probably don't need to get too much into detail about this. I'm in a room of map makers. But I just wanted to cover this briefly at the beginning so that we have a good grounding as we deal with some more complex topics in this talk. So visual contrast describes the measure or implementation of the hierarchy distinction of an array of graphical elements. Essentially, if we look at map A, you'll see that it has super high visual contrast, the white foreground object against a black background, versus something like map B, which has poor visual contrast because although the hues are different, the lightness level between the two objects are relatively the same, i.e. low contrast, so therefore it's a lot harder to read map B compared to map A. Okay, so now that we know what visual contrast is, we should take a step further back to the theories that actually underpins how we understand visual contrast in cartography. And it is rooted in psychology theories that are themselves dated from the early 1900s called the Gestalt perceptual laws. And they describe how humans perceive and make sense of what we see, everything from object formation to perceptual grouping to hierarchy and figure ground. And these sets of theories underpins much or the entirety of cartographic perception theories. However, the more I dug into these old theories on Gestalt perceptual laws, I realized that it has not aged well at all, and psychologists have more and more over the past 30 or so years questioned its validity and highlighted the lack of empirical support for it. And you can sort of imagine my surprise because much of my master's research depended almost entirely on these Gestalt theories. But worse off, and more importantly, much of cartography's existing theories on hierarchy and contrast also were derived from these very same Gestalt theories that psychologists were throwing to the wayside. And that made me realize that this questioning of century-old ideas and musing hasn't really happened in cartography. We haven't really kept up with how psychology theories that we took back in 100 years ago and evolve, how they've changed over time as we became more distinct fields. And this quote from a psychology book really described this very well. It says, "Theories of the Gestaltists has fallen by the wayside, leaving us with a descriptive principle, but without a model of perceptual processing. Indeed, some of these so-called laws of perceptual organization today sounds vague and inadequate." So after researching how contrast is understood in neuropsychology, I found out that, these theories are accepted that visual contrast and Gestalt figure ground is wholly pre-attentional. Perception, it's only important for seeing the object or the map, but not about how we think about the information, how we use it to make decisions. Which, as we sort of covered before, is exactly the opposite of what my own prior research was telling me and what cartographic research has been saying over the past 50 or so years that we've studied these topics. And of course, I was like, WTF, what the figure ground? How can it that what I've been studying for so long, my whole grad career, basically be so thoroughly dismissed? And is it even possible for me to somehow resolve this clearly fundamentally opposing notion? Or is it that we cartographers have just been wrong this whole time? Okay, now that I've laid out the conflict, I'm going to step back a little and talk a little bit more about the visual contrast and give you all a primer and relate that to some of the neuroscience-y stuff. So visual contrast, again, guides reader attention, and the lack of it counters intuitiveness. As hinted over in neuropsychology, visual contrast is studied mostly through the lens of Gestalt figure ground in combination with some basic likeness detection. For the purpose of this talk, I'm going to be talking about figure ground as its most closely related proxy. And figure ground essentially describes the perceptual relationship between the foreground object and the background element, so that whatever is in the foreground or the figure is perceived as of higher importance. And visual contrast is basically describing the strength of that relationship. To the right, you can see the famous vase versus faces figure. It illustrates this process very well because the human brain was evolved to only see one thing at a time. When you look at it, you'll either want to see a vase or two faces, and you can switch between the two. But if you try to exert attentional control to see both at the same time, you end up with a more fuzzy image in your mind where neither is clear. But anyway, okay, now I'm going to get into a little bit more brain stuff. Just a little bit of warning, it's not too important that you know exactly what's happening. Again, we're not neuroscientists, and I'm going to keep it as brief and clear as I can. But it's good to understand what is actually happening when we do look at a figure ground object, or more importantly, what happens when we see a map that has visual contrast and figure ground incorporated. So essentially, the light bounces off the maps into our retina, then it goes to our optic nerve, to the LGN, which ultimately leads to the primary visual cortex in the back of our brain. And then it begins processing what we see. So this process has been identified as part of a larger system called the visual system hierarchy, where more basic elements within what we see are translated and processed by lower level functions, which are then fed into subsequent and more complex processes. On this diagram, it's an array of what some of these processes, where some of these processes occur. And essentially, figure ground happens in this mid-level section in the blue from about V1 to V3. Not too important to understand, but what we do understand about this processing comes from mainly two studies in the 90s. I'm not going to get into too much details, but essentially they tell us that this visual information comes to your brain and then goes to the back through the visual cortex and down the visual stream, going down two pathways as it works towards the free frontal cortex, which is associated with some of our attentional decision-making abilities. And it's actually, this visual process is actually part of a larger so-called visual stream that I think looks more like a mess than a stream. But yeah, anyway, this figure sort of conceptualizes all these related areas that forms this visual stream system in our head. Again, not too important to understand or exactly know what all the notes means, but essentially neuroscientific research from my review basically says that visual contrast is just limited to this lower section and that it has no role in higher, more important functions, meaning that design of visual information has no role, which again counters exactly what my research has shown or what cartography and cartographers have been saying this whole time. So again, that just leaves me scratching my head, trying to figure out how could it be that visual contrast is only for seeing and not for ever attending or thinking about the map. And how is it possible that cartographic literature, which has stated time and time again that visual contrast is essential for guiding users' attention and map reader, be completely discarded by an entire discipline? That gets me to the second part where I try to resolve some of these conflicts. So I realized that much of this conflict ultimately surrounds whether or not a visual contrast would form part of the psychological, neuroscientific, lower level perception versus a higher level cognition process. Not going to get into too much details because limited times, but basically neuroscience and psychology comes at this topic in a very distinct perspective than how we would think about it, in a less holistic and more applied, very on-off switch kind of way. So thinking more deeply about that and reflecting on that, I realized that this dichotomy of having to pick one over the other was wholly unproductive. So I began to come up with this new model to think about this, where I can synthesize what we know in cartography with findings in neuropsychology to show that visual contrast could be important part of perception, but that it could also equally be mediated by visual attention. I conceptualized this process within a visual saliency model, which some of you might have a little bit of familiarity with. Cool. Where visual contrast is conceptualized as part of this interplay spanning perception and cognition. And then I worked on trying to operationalize it, which basically taking some of the existing research that my lab has done into the human function of the brain and how we read and understand map, and using that research as a basis to help us get visibility into this cognitive black box that traditionally cartographers have always been on the outside looking in. We're able to test behavioral measures of users, but we're never able to actually get a glimpse into what is going on that results in those behavioral metrics, right? But there's been more research lately by scholars at UO, Santa Barbara, and elsewhere that has attempted to bridge some of this divide. So taking from all of that research, I can use some of these data as a baseline understanding of, okay, so we sort of know what is happening in your brain when you look at a map, but can we like explore that and apply a bunch of design variations to that to see how that baseline activation and activity changes over time in relation to how we're varying the design of the map. So for my experiment, I brought in 25 participants to look at some of the maps I designed within the scanner and outside of the scanner. So they essentially completed a map rotation task that I'll get to in 1 second to evaluate the visual contrast and see their performance. So research questions I tested. So I wanted to compare both the behavioral metrics and neuroscientific metric. So the first one is based after a more traditional cartographic behavioral study. How does varying visual contrast actually affects the performance of doing a map rotation task, right? And then the second one is basically the same question, but now I want to know how does it affect brain activities in relation to doing those tasks. And the novel thing about trying to do this research is that it takes a dual study approach where it is simultaneously both a traditional behavioral cartographic study, but at the same time it's groundbreaking and novel in that we're interviewing neuroimaging results. So the stimuli themselves were brought in using these fractal globe generator. Fun fact, these were actually, I took this from like open source GitHub where they were designing random maps for Dungeons and Dragons games. And I was like, oh, this is perfect. I needed some random looking mappy globe things. So these globes were designed because I didn't want any real world references, but I wanted them to still look like a map because research have shown that real world references will always override any information or any design variation that you do in these types of research. And I went with a round globe because for this it's going to be a map rotation task, so I didn't want the frame to be a confounding variables. And these globes have a perfect 1-to-1 water-to-land ratios, and I controlled for other design properties so that I can focus just on the variables being tested. I pulled the hues from my existing master thesis research with Cindy, and then implemented it across some lightness variations to create 24 testing conditions that spans hue and lightness contrasts applied to a few types of different globe variations. And I'm just going to quickly go through a small sample of the actual task. The task itself is pretty simple. Users are shown these two globes, and in a split second, less than 8 seconds, they're asked to make a quick judgment call of whether the globe, the second globe, is rotated or rotated and flipped in relation to the first globe shown. For this one, it's shown that the globe was rotated and flipped, and for this example, it was the low hue contrast with high lightness contrast. Again, another example, they see a different design, and they were asked the same question. This one, they were judging, this one it was rotated and flipped, and it was low hue plus high lightness. So yeah, they completed this evaluation on 128 trials on a laptop, and then again, another 128 trial within the scanner. Relatively simple, straightforward, nothing too complex. But now you might be wondering, why was it that simple? That's because the tasks themselves and whether or not they got the questions right weren't super important. I was still analyzing the performance and the accuracy and the response time, but I really wanted to get at how their brains were activating in response to some of these variables. So I had to strip everything back and just focus on the main variables themselves. Okay, at this point you might be wondering, how does one even go about analyzing brain data? It's actually pretty straightforward. It's essentially a spatial analysis using a GLM. There's still X and Y, but now there's a Z, so instead of thinking about a brain as a brain, you can think about it as a stack of raster, where there's just a bunch of three-dimensional cells that are on top of each other, and we just need to search for where is the significant activation. Okay, so some quick results. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I've already run way too long, and I'm saving a lot of that for articles. But hopefully, so y'all have to go read those. But analyzing mainly the response time and the accuracy, because brain data is hard to explain in a slide. The response time and accuracy, I found that there were an interesting relationship. These figures show the interaction effect between hue and lightness contrast for response time on the left and accuracy on the right. The contrast variables themselves are on the bottom, so hue on the left and lightness on the right. And you'll see that, you can see that the response time and accuracy have an inverse relationship with the contrast variables. So low hue with low contrast yielded the lowest response time, i.e. the quickest response time. So when you have a map with low hue and low contrast, people answer it right away. But that does not mean that they were more accurate in responding to that question. That was an interesting thing I saw. However, in terms of accuracy, people were most accurate when they were shown maps with high hue contrast with high lightness contrast. Essentially, we already noticed, or I think we sort of noticed, high contrast means people are able to get at the information better. This research essentially just confirms that. But there were also interesting patterns because these interactions were not consistently significant in all cases. There was significant effect from the actual map variables themselves because when we evaluated these contrasts on their own, it turns out they weren't statistically significant. Hue contrast only becomes significant when we factor in the rotation type of the task. So the map being flipped versus map being rotated. So hue contrast only becomes statistically significant as in affecting this mean under the specific task dependent that the subjects are doing. And then for lightness, lightness contrast is only significant under specific map type that the subjects look at. Okay, so again, jumping over a little bit, but looking what does these numbers mean? People are more accurate when maps have high contrast. They're less accurate or least accurate on maps with low lightness contrast. And lightness contrast has the highest effect on improving accuracy in comparison to hue. In terms of response time, people answer the fastest when on maps with low contrast. And the maps that have the longest response time, meaning people tend to think it's more complicated, takes more time before answering, were maps with high hue and low lightness. So again, lightness plays sort of an overarching effect on how people use these information. And yeah, just wrapping up. So you'll see that the behavioral data pattern is clear. High contrast maps are better for task accuracy, but that again, it goes back to the map context will always play an overriding role on how the users use and perceive these patterns. In terms of brain data, I'm skipping that today. I still have some models I want to complete before I want to talk about them, so you'll just have to wait on that for in the papers, but there are significant activations along your hippocampus, which is related to memory and recall and attention making. And yeah, research question, yes. Clear patterns and analysis ongoing, some brain data stuff. Cool. With that, I'll wrap up. Sorry, I'm over time, but thanks to my funder.